Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative. And I'm joined today by my two co-presenters, Peter Lynn, Executive Director of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, and Cherie Todoroff, Deputy Director of Housing for Health for the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services. Today's webinar will last from 2 until 4 p.m. unless we conclude sooner. We will take about 1 hour to present a range of information, which will leave about 1 hour to respond to questions and receive comments, either electronically, which is preferred, or by phone. And we'll say more when we enter the question and comment period about the mechanism for raising questions and comments. So today's webinar is triggered by the approval on March 7th of this year, a little over a month ago, of a 1/4 cent dedicated sales tax, which will generate an estimated $355 million annually for 10 years to be used exclusively to combat homelessness. Over 69% of Los Angeles County voters approved Measure H in this historic election. Measure H, as you see, is projected to help an estimated 45,000 families and individuals move from homelessness into permanent housing in the first 5 years that Measure H will be in effect, while enabling an additional 30,000 families and individuals to avoid becoming homeless. When the Board of Supervisors adopted the ordinance placing Measure H on the ballot, the board identified 19 specific strategies for which the Measure H revenue can be utilized. Those strategies consist of 15 of the strategies initially approved by the Board of Supervisors in February 2016 as the result of an inclusive and comprehensive planning process that brought together over 400 individuals in 18 policy summits in the fall and winter of 2015, plus 4 new strategies which were discussed extensively in that initial planning process, but which could not be implemented with the one-time funding of $100 million initially approved by the Board of Supervisors. Now, though the Board of Supervisors identified the specific list of allowable uses of the Measure H revenue, the board did not specify the amount of funding that would be used for each of those strategies. Instead, the Board of Supervisors directed the Los Angeles County Homeless Initiative to convene an inclusive planning process and collaborative planning process to develop specific funding recommendations for consideration by the Board of Supervisors. The Measure H Revenue Planning Work Group consists of 50 key stakeholders, from cities and councils of governments, homeless service providers, county departments, faith leaders, individuals with lived homelessness experience, local homeless policy experts, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, and United Way Home for Good. And this work group is charged with developing specific funding recommendations for the Board of Supervisors, final recommendations for fiscal year 2017-18, which begins on July 1st of this year, and tentative recommendations for the next 2 years, 18-19 and 19-20. The Revenue Planning Group has met on 3 occasions and will meet twice more on May 4th and May 10th to conclude its work. Today's webinar and the public comment process that will begin tomorrow and run through May 1st are important elements of this overall planning process and will inform the deliberations of the Measure H Revenue Planning Work Group. We'll be spending most of the rest of this webinar discussing the 19 specific strategies that are eligible for Measure H funding, where we will be briefly describing the strategy and sharing the currently requested level of funding. At the outset of the planning process, the lead county departments and agencies responsible for each of the strategies developed a funding request, which was shared with the 50-member planning work group and have been discussed during the work group's first 3 meetings. At the conclusion of the 3rd meeting, the work group asked the county department and the agency lead representatives for each strategies to go back and revise the funding request so that the total amount of the request would not exceed the $355 million in estimated annual revenue from Measure H. Therefore, the funding requests which we will be reviewing today reflect the work that occurred between the last meeting of the revenue work group on April 13th and today. Therefore, the funding amounts that will be discussed today are not recommended by the planning work group. Instead, these are revised funding requests by the lead county agencies for each strategy, which will be discussed by the revenue planning work group commencing on May 4th, which will include the input from today's webinar, as well as the written input through the community comment process that will run from tomorrow through May 1st, and which we'll discuss in more detail later in this webinar. Before we move into the discussion of the individual strategies, in a moment I'm going to ask Peter Lynn from the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority to describe the year 1 model that is currently showing on the screen. Of the 19 strategies, there are 7 strategies which are at the core of the homeless service delivery system: outreach, crisis housing, permanent housing, and the coordinated entry system. Together, the funding requests for these 7 strategies account for more than 80% of the requested funding from Measure H, which we will be reviewing today. And additionally, there are very close interactions among these 7 strategies. So, though we will be discussing each of the strategies individually, to provide appropriate context, Peter Lynn will now walk us through this slide and describe how these various strategies fit together. And then as we move forward through the strategies individually, we'll talk about each of these 7 strategies separately in addition to the other 12 strategies. So with that, I want to ask Peter Lynn to walk us through this slide.
Thanks, Phil. I want to point out that, of the core strategies listed out here, obviously the key outcome that we're looking for is housing people. The ultimate resolution of homelessness is a placement into permanent housing. And so the permanent housing strategies here are the linchpin. That's D7, permanent supportive housing and services that support that, and B3, a rapid rehousing, which is a short-term rental assistance and financial intervention with some case management services. Typically, we're focusing our permanent supportive housing on the high need, high acuity folks. People with lower acuity, lower barriers are better targeted to rapid rehousing. Those are the outcomes that we're looking for. But in order to navigate people to a permanent housing placement, we need to provide a stable platform for them to get their documents together, to get their applications filled out, to get their trajectory on point for that. So we have interim housing, which is bridge housing, crisis housing. B7 is for folks who are exiting institutions. One of the key ideas that we've seen in the strategy formulation and in ideas addressing homelessness is that there are institutions that exit people into homelessness. Typically our criminal justice system, our health systems, and often, unfortunately, our foster system can exit people into homelessness. And the idea here is to intervene before that happens. So this strategy B7 provides beds that are specifically interventions for folks who are exiting institutions that might otherwise end up in homelessness. E8 is a general infrastructure of crisis housing, what we used to think of as emergency shelter. These are beds for people who are in points of navigation through from the street to a permanent housing outcome. There are also some crisis beds for people who fall into homelessness, but largely we're trying to focus that resource on people in need of navigation to a permanent housing outcome, people who need a place to go when they've been connected through engagement through the front end, which is outreach on the street. E6, countywide outreach teams, there's a depth of skill there to go out into encampments, to go out to where people are on the street, engage them, connect to them, whether it's through their the health needs, their behavioral health needs, or just a general need for assistance, assess their needs, get them connected into a housing resource, and move them to a permanent housing outcome. The graphic indicates, obviously, that E6 is one key means of placing people into shelter, but obviously other folks who fall into homelessness who are not connected through our outreach teams will also encounter the shelter system, and there's room for that. It is also true that people navigate to a permanent housing outcome without going through the shelter system. It's not necessary. It is, it does happen on a regular basis, and we do not require that people pass through a shelter in order to get to a permanent housing. So you'll see the royal blue bar there that can pass through and go to permanent housing, either permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing. But we do want to make sure that those beds are available in order to form that stable platform for people to navigate to a permanent housing outcome. And obviously, undergirding that is a systemic architecture that ties all of these things together. We have coordination through community-based providers that have been funded to act as the lead agency within each service planning area. They are working with a collaborative framework of other providers that cover their entire service planning area, serve all populations, and that really tie together what had been a loose confederation of individual programs into a system-wide architecture. So there is a clear coordination with all these street outreach, making sure that there's no duplication and that there's no spots unmapped or uncovered, making sure that the beds that are available to those folks who are navigating people from the street, making sure that the housing placements are in service of getting people moved through a shelter system, and all of that with a robust information technology backbone and the services components that help tie it all together.
Thank you, Peter. All right, so now we're going to be moving through the 19 strategies that, including the 7 that Peter just referenced, that are eligible to Measure H funding in the 6 categories in which the homeless initiative is organized. So our first category is preventing homelessness, because as important as it is to help the families, youth, and adults who are currently homeless reach, secure, and retain permanent housing, it is also important that we intervene to try to slow the flow of families and individuals into homelessness. So strategy A1, Homelessness Prevention Program for Families, and the corresponding strategy A5 is Homeless Prevention Program for Individuals. So since LAHSA is the lead agency for both of these strategies, I'm going to go back to Peter Lynn and ask him if he'll present these 2 strategies.
Thank you, Phil. So strategy A1 is one of those that is already up and running. There was funding through the initial efforts to get homelessness prevention for families off the ground. That program is up and running across in all service planning areas. Essentially, families that it works with families that are facing an imminent housing crisis or at risk of coming into the shelters, and attempting to get them resituated before they essentially hit our crisis system or become homeless. The idea is that, short-term interventions of financial assistance and supportive services, as well as some legal services and other kinds of assistance, can prevent folks from becoming homeless, which is both less expensive to the overall system and far less of a burden of stress and anxiety on the family. So this strategy is up and running. The intent here is to provide continuation. So the first year, there's less money because there's money on that's up and running, and the out years will continue at a level funding of about $6 million.
So the $3 million requested for Measure H in year one would be combined with an estimated $3 million, which remains available from the one-time funding for the homeless initiative originally approved by the Board of Supervisors in February 2016. So this would be sustained at a $6 million annual program.
That's right. And we'll add legal services at some level for some of the families that are facing legal issues. There's a similar approach for prevention in A5, which is not a strategy that is up and running. We did not have funding for single adults. So this is a new strategy, but it follows very closely on the lessons learned and the form factor for the strategy that we put together for families. It includes legal services. In this case, the target number of interventions is greater. There is a far greater number of single individuals who are experiencing homelessness than families. So that by scaling up from about 800 households served in year one to about 1,600 and 1,700 served in the remaining years, that's how those programs dollars will be targeted.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we're moving on to the second of 6 categories, subsidizing housing, which is one of the 2 categories where the greatest amount of Measure H funding is requested. And while there is tremendous variation in the circumstances of among homeless families and adults, one of the things that the vast majority of homeless families and adults have in common is that they don't have sufficient income today to pay the full cost of their own rent, hence the importance of subsidized housing. So the first strategy here, B1, is subsidized housing for homeless disabled individuals pursuing SSI. And this program is administered by the Department of Public Social Services and is specifically for homeless disabled participants in the county's general relief program. So through this, DPSS provides a modest rental subsidy, which will increase from $400 to $475 per month, which when coupled with $100 per month from the general relief grant, results in in $575 available for housing. The funding request here is to sustain the expansion in this program, which was implemented with the one-time funding initially approved by the Board of Supervisors in February 2016. The next strategy is one of the 7 core strategies which Peter described in reviewing the graphic a few minutes ago, and this involves rapid rehousing. So let me turn it back to Peter for this strategy.
So B3 is also a strategy that's up and running. Both the Department of Health Services and LAHSA have implemented programs that are doing rapid rehousing. We have had a family rapid rehousing program for many years that's funded through Department of Public and Social Services and some of our federal grants. And we also we have a pilot with youth, and the Department of Health Services is working with single adults. The idea here is to scale those programs up considerably. Rapid rehousing has been a very effective intervention. It is a good target for folks who have the prospect of increasing their income or actually working but are unable to get into housing due to the lack of security deposits and other assistance. It also provides in the model that we've proposed for B3 on a forward-going basis under Measure H, we've asked for funding for a shallow subsidy in there, which is a sort of a hybrid. It's the expectation there is that there are long-term there are folks with longer-term needs for affordability that are essentially waiting for affordable units, and we can keep folks housed using a shallow subsidy platform rather than have them fall into homelessness while they're essentially waiting other housing interventions. So there's flexibility within the strategy that's proposed, but the majority of it follows a model that we have used to great effect in Los Angeles and has been used very well across the country.
Yeah, so let me just clarify, or just say a little more about the concept of the shallow subsidy. Traditionally in rapid rehousing, a person or a family or adult receives a rental subsidy for 6 months up to 12 months and employment and case management services. And the notion is that the person is in housing that they should be able to sustain after that 6 to 12 month period, typically through employment, though sometimes through federal disability benefits. And what we're finding in Los Angeles County is that because rents are comparatively high, that there are situations where a person in rapid rehousing is able to secure employment or increase their employment, but they still have a bit of a gap. And they need what Peter is referring to as a shallow subsidy, which might be $200 or $300 a month. There's that coupled with their income will enable them to retain their permanent housing, and therefore, in the funding request for this strategy, there's funding included to provide those shallow subsidies where needed. Okay, let's move on to the next strategy, B4. This is a strategy that's actually a specific response to the shortage of affordable housing in Los Angeles County. And because of that shortage, there are frequently large numbers of households seeking to rent a given unit. And therefore, low-income families and adults, including homeless families and adults who have a federal housing subsidy, are frequently competing with unsubsidized prospective tenants. And though the federal government is a very good payer and a regular payer for the rental subsidy, some of the administrative requirements and the timing issues associated with receiving a federal subsidy often dissuades landlords in this tight housing market from accepting a Section 8 voucher or other federal housing subsidy, particularly from a homeless family or adult. So to address that, this strategy provides one-time funding, primarily for landlord incentives, to encourage landlords to accept homeless families and adults who have a federal housing subsidy. And this consists of holding fees for landlords so they don't lose rent during the time that the unit is being processed for federal approval, guarantee against excess damage, and move-in assistance for the prospective tenants. Currently, this strategy is limited to the federal housing subsidies administered by the Housing Authority of the County of Los Angeles, though the City of Los Angeles does have a comparable strategy for the subsidies they administer. However, there are about 16 other smaller housing authorities in the County of Los Angeles in various cities that typically don't have programs of this nature. And the recommended level of funding or the requested level of funding for this strategy would extend these landlord incentives to housing subsidies administered by all public housing authorities in the county who do not currently offer such a program. This funding is not intended to replace those current local programs in city-administered housing authorities, but to establish programs where they do not exist, or to supplement the funding for public housing authorities where they do exist, but where the program is less extensive than what is offered currently for the subsidies administered by the Housing Authority of the County of Los Angeles. This strategy is specifically for permanent supportive housing. So that is for those other housing authorities. If this is ultimately approved, the county would be offering Measure H revenue to enable those housing authorities to help people, homeless families and adults, typically homeless adults, in their jurisdictions who need permanent supportive housing to secure a unit with a federal voucher. The next strategy, family reunification housing subsidies, is specifically for those families where the child or children have been removed by the Department of Children and Family Services, but where the parents have made sufficient progress that the children could be safely returned to their parents, except for the fact that the parents are homeless. Therefore, under this strategy, which has been implemented with one-time funding earlier this year, instead of paying for foster care costs, the Department of Children and Family Services pays for rental subsidies and related services for those parents so that they can reunify with their children. As we see on the next slide, the expectation with this request is that the level of funding needed for this strategy will decline dramatically in these initial 3 years, because as families are enrolled in this program, the Department of Children and Family Services will realize savings in foster care payments, which they can then be reinvested in rental subsidies and related services for additional families in the future. So the recommended funding level here would start at addressing the full estimated need for the number of families who could qualify for this program. Then it would be cut in half the following year as the savings that can be reinvested kick in. And then finally, by year 3, the projection is that this program would be fully self-sustaining within the Department of Children and Family Services, and that no ongoing Measure H funding would be required. The next strategy, B7, is the second of the 7 core strategies that were addressed in the graphic that Peter reviewed at the outset of this webinar. And this involves bridge housing for adults or youth who would be homeless upon exiting an institution. And I want to ask Sheree Todoroff from the Department of Health Services to describe this strategy.
Thank you. Yes, this interim housing is for individuals exiting institutions, and that includes jails, public and private hospitals, and the foster care system. This is a strategy that has already been implemented. LAHSA has contracted for beds for individuals exiting institutions through the initial Homeless Initiative one-time funding, as well as DHS, who has contracted for beds to serve these individuals. The DHS beds are intended to serve individuals with more complex health and behavioral health conditions who may need a higher level of on-site wraparound services to be stable in interim housing. So what this request will do is it will maintain the beds that have already been implemented by DHS and LAHSA, and will increase the number of beds in fiscal year 17-18 to around 1,000 beds, and then add about 200 additional beds in fiscal year 18-19 to get us to 1,200 beds and maintain those beds into 18-19. About 1/4 to 40% of those beds would be serving those clients with the higher acuity needs who need more intensive services on site in their interim housing.
Thank you, Sheree. Okay, we're now going to move on to our third category around increasing income, because though almost all homeless families and adults need a rental subsidy now, many homeless families and adults have the ability to increase their income over time, either through securing employment or increasing employment, or qualifying through federal disability benefits. So the first strategy here under strategy C2 is a comprehensive, multifaceted strategy to increase employment opportunities for homeless adults through supporting social enterprise, only one of the 5 elements of this strategy requires funding. Several of the others, such as providing preferential treatment for social enterprise in county procurement processes, the first bullet on this slide, does not require funding for Measure H. But the third bullet, providing a subsidy to alternate staffing organizations who provide employment for currently or recently homeless adults, does require funding for Measure H. Specifically, the concept here is to provide a $2 per work hour subsidy for alternative staffing organizations operated by social enterprises to enable them to compete more effectively for contracts with either the public or private sector to provide temporary employees and meet the enhanced service needs of current or recently homeless adults. There is $2 million in one-time funding that remains available for this strategy out of the funding approved by the Board of Supervisors in February 2016, which is projected to be utilized in the coming fiscal year. Hence, there is no funding request for Measure H in fiscal year 17-18, and then the request is to sustain the program at this level, which would serve an estimated 1,000 adults each year in 6 months employment opportunities. The next strategy is actually a combination of 3 of the original strategies, C4, C5, and C6, and relates to disabled adults and the effort to increase their income through access to federal disability benefits. I'm going to ask Sheree Todoroff to speak to this strategy.
Thank you. Yes, this strategy is intended to serve disabled homeless adults or those at risk of homelessness who need assistance with benefits advocacy, and includes targeted efforts as well for those in custody settings and who are exiting custody settings, as well as a veterans benefit component. This initiative is already implemented. It was implemented on April 1st. There are community-based homeless service providers in each of the service planning areas who are going through training and starting to roll out and start providing services as we speak. They are co-located in DPSS offices. They have community-based locations where clients can come in, and they're also co-located in county custody facilities. What this request will do will increase the number of clients who can be served. So with the current funding that was originally allocated, it was estimated that approximately 5,600 benefits applications would be submitted annually. And this request will double that to 11,200 annually. And it will also provide some enhanced services that are anticipated to increase the approval rate of these applications, such as record retrieval services, comprehensive evaluations and appeal services for clients who need those, payee services. And in addition, this is a combination of some one-time funds that are ongoing, but there are 2 components of this initiative, the veterans component and the inmate component, that were one-time funds. And so this refunding request will maintain those components so those clients can continue to receive benefits advocacy services.
Yeah, so just to add in on the funding, so this is a little bit complicated because of the 3 strategies. There is ongoing funding of just under $7 million per year for strategy C4. That's the basic SSI advocacy program. And the funding that was allocated for C5, which is Veterans Benefits Advocacy, and C6, SSI advocacy for county jail inmates, that was one-time funding. So this funding for Measure H will complement the ongoing funding that remains available for strategy C4 and allow for the enhancement and expansion described by Sheree. The last strategy in this increasing income category is one of the 4 new strategies that was not implemented as part of the initial package of 47 homeless initiative strategies. And this is a proposed subsidized employment program for single adults. Under subsidized employment, the currently or recently homeless adult will have a temporary job where the wage will be paid in whole or in part through Measure H, and there'd be associated services, and the goal is to enable that adult to transition into permanent unsubsidized employment at the end of the subsidized employment period. There's currently a large similar program for parents in the CalWorks program, and there is a subset of that program that is specifically targeted to currently or recently homeless parents. This proposed strategy is modeled on that well-established existing program. And we see here the requested level of funding is essentially $5 million annually. The increases there are based on projected increased costs, for example, associated with the coming increases in the state minimum wage. We're now moving on to the fourth of the 6 categories, providing case management and services. And as we know, though a housing subsidy is very important, it is almost never sufficient. That most homeless families and adults need some level of services, though the duration and nature of those services varies greatly depending on the individual circumstances. The first 3 strategies that we'll be discussing in this category all relate to homeless adults who are either incarcerated in the county jails or who have a prior history with the criminal justice system. And I'm going to ask Cherie, either on behalf of DHS or on behalf of the county's Office of Diversion and Reentry, which is part of the Department of Health Services in collaboration with the Sheriff's Department, the Probation Department, the District Attorney, and the Public Defender and Alternate Public Defender. I'm going to ask Cherie to present each of the next 3 strategies.
Thank you. So strategy D2 is to expand jail in-reach. This strategy was implemented in January of this year. What is happening under this strategy is individuals who are identified as being homeless, who are within the county jail system, are being connected to resources and services with the goal that they are linked to those services as they're exiting these custody settings. So what is occurring right now are there are sheriff custody assistants, and there are DHS social workers, and there are homeless service provider case managers who are in the custody settings, who are identifying the inmates who are homeless and are starting to work with them while they are in custody, and then are linking them to services such as the shelter services or those bridge housing beds that we talked about under B7 for those exiting institutions, as well as getting them into the coordinated entry system, and so they are in the queue for permanent housing. They're also doing general case management and reentry planning with these clients. So they're seeking to touch them while they're in custody and to link them to those resources as they're exiting custody.
And with respect to the funding level here.
Yes, and with the funding level here, because this strategy was implemented recently in January, there was the initial one-time funding that was available under the Homeless Initiative that is funding it in fiscal year 17-18 and part of 18-19. And what we're seeing in 19-20 is sort of the level of funding that we would need on an ongoing basis to maintain the strategy. And strategy D4 is regional integrated reentry networks with a homeless focus. This is a strategy that is scheduled to be implemented later this year in June of 2017, so in the next couple of months. And specifically what this strategy is about is embedding case managers into clinics that are seeing individuals who are homeless and who are coming out of custody settings, and also with our community-based reentry providers so that they can link those homeless clients who are coming into these settings to the homeless services system of care. And that would include into shelter beds, in connecting them to the benefits advocacy services, getting them into CES so they're in the queue for permanent housing, connecting them to health and behavioral health services, among other services. And so this is targeting those individuals once they are in the community setting again and getting them connected into that mainstream homeless system of care. And this is a strategy that also received one-time funding under the initial Homeless Initiative funding, and so we are not requesting additional funding for fiscal year 17 or 18 because the one-time funding will cover the cost of this program during those years. And then the initial Measure H funding request comes in fiscal year 19-20 so that we can maintain the program.
And then I actually misspoke before when I said Sheree was going to cover the next 3 strategies. It was just the next 2. This next strategy, D6, is a criminal record clearing project. And the goal here is to help homeless adults, whether they are in shelters or on the street or in encampments, to clear their criminal records either through expungement or other legal processes, since a criminal record is can be a significant impediment to both housing and employment. To achieve this, the funding request is to establish 2 mobile units, so 2 specialized vehicles that would be staffed by an attorney and paralegal from the public defender, and they would go to where homeless people are, to shelters, to encampments, to outreach, homeless service events, and on the spot would have the ability to take the necessary actions electronically that would be intended to lead to the clearing of the individual's criminal record. We see here there's a little bit of one-time money that has not yet been utilized, which is why the first-year funding request is slightly smaller. We see that this is a modest request of $600,000 annually, going up to $700,000 annually. The final strategy in this category, D7, is one of the core strategies that Peter described at the beginning involving permanent supportive housing, and Sheree's going to present this.
So this is a strategy to provide services and rental subsidies for permanent supportive housing. The services would be intensive case management services that would be available to all clients who are housed through D7. That would include ongoing assessment and ongoing case management. It would be field-based. The case managers meet the clients where they're at, wherever that may be. The services also include linkage to health and behavioral health services, entry into the benefits advocacy services that we talked about, assistance with basic life skills, so a whole range of comprehensive whatever it takes services for these clients. In addition to this, all of these clients would be matched to a rental subsidy. Those subsidies could be either a federal subsidy or it could be a local rental subsidy that is funded through Measure H. And the goal is to serve approximately 2,500 people in fiscal year 17-18, increasing to approximately 5,400 people in 18-19, and increasing again to close to 7,800 people in fiscal year 19-20, And so what that means is sort of by the end of fiscal year 19-20, there would be 7,800 people moved into permanent supportive housing.
And this strategy, as you'll see, is the one where the level of funding each year increases to the greatest degree. And the reason for that is that contrary to all of the other strategies that we've discussed, this is a strategy where the same people continue to receive assistance on a multi-year basis. On average, a person is projected to remain in permanent supportive housing for 7 years. So therefore, in the arc of time that we're looking at here, the number of people accumulates. So the 2,000 people or 2,500 people served in year 1 continue to be served in year 2 plus the additional people from year 2. And that's the reason why the funding request for this strategy grows as substantially as it does, in contrast to any of the other strategies where the people served in 1 year, typically people would not be served in a given strategy for more than 1 year, with the exception of this strategy, D7. We're moving on now to the 5th of our 6 categories, creating a coordinated system, where the homeless families and adults rely heavily and have extensive interactions with both the homeless service systems and the mainstream service delivery systems, primarily health, social services, and criminal justice. And there's much we need to do to make these various elements of our complex systems function together in the most effective manner possible. So this is a series of strategies that do that either by tying together existing services or by enhancing specific services that are key to effective utilization of the rest of the system. So first here is the countywide outreach system, strategy E6, which again is one of the 7 core strategies which Peter described at the beginning, and Peter will say more about this strategy now.
Thanks, Phil. So we, LASA, are co-leads on this strategy with our partners at the Department of Mental Health and the health agency, including Department of Health Services, Department of Public Health, and Mental Health, all worked with LASA, all worked very closely on this strategy. It is a complex strategy that leverages our current investment and extends greatly our ability to conduct robust, coordinated outreach to the people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. 75% of the people experiencing homelessness in LA are on our streets in makeshift dwellings in vehicles. They're not in shelter, the vast majority. So we have to go out and talk to them where we encounter them out in our communities. This strategy combines funding for outreach coordination, which is a key function since field-based services can often trip over each other or leave gaps, with a detailed outlay of multidisciplinary teams that include health and behavioral health specialists with some generalists, as well as regional deployment of generalist teams that are connected to the coordinated entry system, and some funding to continue outreach through LASA's direct provision of services through our emergency response teams. So LASA has an embedded provider team of our own. We coordinate with law enforcement and with Bureau of Public Works and other sanitation cleanups. Our coordinated entry system leads were funded last year through a variety of mechanisms, including one-time city, county, and state funds to start building out some generalist teams. And the county also invested $9 million to build out 16 multidisciplinary teams of the kind that employ health and behavioral health specialists. So that group of teams is spread out across the county. The intent is to expand that. We would add additional regional coordination so that there are parts of the county where there are single coordinators holding down a very large area. So we would add coordinators to assist with that and to assist with call centers. We would add multidisciplinary teams, and we would add generalists. So that the idea would be that starting from a base of 39 teams deployed now, we would add 18 teams in year 1 to 57, and we would again add another 17 in year 2, so that by year 3 we had 77 teams deployed. In addition, we're adding funding for our countywide 211 system to interface directly with that, so that to facilitate a single point of contact from the community and from other providers. And there is some funding proposed for sheriff's department deputies for some of the areas of the county that are very, very hard to serve. This does give a really robust front door entry to our coordinated entry system, and is the sort of first point of contact largely for the people experiencing homelessness on the street. The scale of the investment is such that we would expect to to contact well over 10,000 individuals, but be able to place about 5,800 into our crisis housing system in year one, and that would the expectation on the ability to pull people in and do shelter placements would go to 7,400. Obviously, the intent there is to then ensure that later on they're further connected into permanent housing. This is sort of the front door approach and the first link in a connection to get people into housing.
If I could just underscore 2 points here. One is about the importance of the fact that we now have a countywide outreach coordinator at LAHSA, and we have one or more coordinators in each of the 8 service planning areas that function like dispatchers to channel outreach requests to the appropriate team within the service planning area. And then secondly, the 211 function that Peter described will enable first responders, faith organizations, cities, businesses, and members of the public to submit a request for homeless outreach to an individual or family or an encampment on the street or in an encampment. And that will be primarily, the focus of that will be electronic submissions, but it will be possible to do it by phone as well. And that will really create this sort of coordination around outreach that we've never had before. Next, let's move on to strategy E7, which was one of the 2 at the bottom of the graphic that Peter described, part of the infrastructure or the architecture, as Peter described it, around strengthening the coordinated entry system. Peter?
So the coordinated entry system is our way of tying together all these elements into a single framework. It is several years old at this point, and has been expanding. It's one of the pieces of strategy that came from the federal government. There was a clear intention in the HEART Act, which is associated with all the federal government's homeless assistance grants, that all communities needed to create a coordinated assessment system and way of bringing together all the services. It's a recognition that traditionally we had funded individual standalone programs that didn't collaborate well, and in fact it had no incentive to collaborate and work together. This was, also the case in Los Angeles. It's a very large community. It's the most populous county in the United States, and has a great number of people experiencing homelessness, and a really good cohort of world-class service providers. But there was very little incentive to coordinate their care between themselves, and there was no agreed standard of assessment and prioritization methodology for getting people access to the housing and services resources that we do have available. So we built out a collaborative infrastructure. It's based on a regional approach. So each of the 8 service planning areas across Los Angeles County has a lead agency. And that lead agency is funded with coordination dollars to help bring together all of the providers within that service planning area. In addition, they're tasked with creating regional hubs so that there is a really deep network of really locally community-based providers, because even our service planning areas are quite dense. Each of them, will itself have over 1 million residents in it. So the idea is that you will create a network of regional hubs, and that all the providers will then have a common infrastructure. So whatever they do best, there are many providers that have there are many providers that provide a range of services, but those that have a single service can connect to the services that are downstream essentially from where they are. So if they're a shelter provider, they can connect with outreach to bring people into those beds, and they can connect to the housing providers to get people housed. There are elements within our system that have not been well integrated. So there is a system of resources for people fleeing domestic violence and intimate partner violence that has not traditionally been connected very well to the other forms of homeless assistance that we have. So there's coordination in here for that, and also some function to continue funding that domestic violence services. Regional coordination is an activity that we did not fund in the past. It was essentially an unfunded mandate on these service providers, but it does take staff and it does take work, and we need to fund that activity if we're expecting them to provide it. Navigation assistance. Obviously, people need to move through this system that we're creating, and we need to provide them with help to do that. So the idea behind navigation is to keep moving people through this process and to get them from our assessment to the front door of their permanent housing outcome. We were asking for funding in this proposal for housing location. It turns out that working with landlords is more of a specialized task function. It requires a kind of specialized set of skills and is different from case management. We've learned that the regions in Los Angeles that are performing the best have folks who are specialized in that area and are really just focused on getting new landlords to work with us. That's an area. We've asked for significant training dollars. We're asking for technical assistance and capacity building. Obviously, as we scale up to do this new work, all of the providers that we've been relying on for the past several years to do the work that they've been doing will have to grow significantly. They need the capacity to do that, so we're working with our providers now to understand what their needs are, but also to get the funding to actually fund those activities. And then there are a number of other services. Obviously, the technology platform is really important. There's an element of ensuring that we tie together all of the information that we're capturing and that we use it to the best extent that we can. There are access centers that we want to make sure that we don't lose that infrastructure from our continuum and from the countywide point of connection to people experiencing homelessness. So this covers a range of different services. The key concept, though, is that it is the glue to tie together all the different program elements and ensure they're coordinated effectively and that we're using all of the tools that we have in the most efficient way.
Thank you. So Cherie already talked about bridge housing, which is interim housing for people start DB7 for individuals, specifically those exiting institutions. This is the complement to that, the broader strategy to enhance the emergency shelter system. And go back to Peter to talk about this.
So this does include a number of shelter beds that, so, in the last year or two, we have begun the transformation of what was an overnight 14-hour first come, first serve shelter system to a 24-hour reserve bed bridge shelter system. So there's a transformation going on. Most of our shelters were standalone. The people came, they had to line up every night. They were not guaranteed a bed. And there was, very little interaction with the rest of our system. And so, the numbers of people who got placed into permanent housing were not particularly large. At this point, we're funding those shelters to run 24 hours. We are expecting that their housing placements, that the performance on housing placements is much higher than it has been in the past. And we are utilizing those beds as points of navigation through to a housing placement. This strategy would expand the number of beds. So from a base of about 1,700 currently funded beds, we would add about 1,000, a little over 1,000 to that. So, have about 2,700, 2,750 in year.
In year one, 17, 18.
Right. And 3,500 in year two. And, to top out at about 3,800 in year three. And the expectation is that we could serve, the people turning over in those beds would be about every 120 days. We had initially been looking at sort of 90 days to move people through to a housing placement. It's taking a little bit longer, so slightly more conservative estimates here. But they could essentially serve, that bed facility would serve 3 people over the course of the year as we're navigating people to a housing outcome. Some of those beds are for higher acuity stabilization needs that Cherie mentioned earlier. There are beds in there targeting youth. There are beds in there targeting families. So we have a different portfolio. It's a portfolio mix of those. But the idea basically is that we will ensure that the shelter and the architecture that we have is part of the overall system of moving people from the street to housing.
Yes, one of the key points here is that our expectation is that by having the shelters open 24 hours and being an effective platform for people in shelter to access permanent housing and services, that over time the duration of the length of shelter stays would go down compared to what would have otherwise been the case. And that has the same effect as increasing capacity. If a person spends 4 months in shelter instead of 6 months in shelter, then in the course of a year, 3 people can use that slot instead of 2, and we've just increased our shelter capacity by 50% without adding a bed. So this is a combination of increasing the number of beds and enhancing the quality of the beds, which should result in a shorter duration, which would further increase capacity. I do want to say specifically about the funding here that we'll see something that we haven't seen before, where we have an ongoing funding level from Measure H requested of $56 million. But in addition, in year 1, some of the strategies will cost less than they will in subsequent years. For example, D7, permanent supportive housing, would be substantially less expensive because the number of people served would accumulate over time. Other strategies like homeless prevention for individuals, A5, is a new strategy, so it would take 6 months to implement and therefore would cost less in year 1. So for a combination of those sorts of situations, there is available funding in year 1 that would not be available in subsequent years. And therefore, the recommendation here is to create a one-time pot, or the request is to create a one-time pot for crisis housing of $93 million, which would supplement the ongoing funding for strategies B7, bridge housing, and E8, which we're discussing now. And that funding, that $93 million, would roll over year to year until it was fully utilized. This approach also reflects the assessment that the capacity to move people into permanent housing, whether it's rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, will increase over time, and therefore that there will be some reduction in the need for crisis housing beds. And the gap analysis, which LAHSA conducted in January 2016, identified an ongoing need for increased shelter beds, but also a temporary and interim need for increasing shelter beds. And this recommended one-time funding amount is consistent with that analysis. The last strategy in this category, and the last of the 7 core strategies on the graphic which Peter described, involves enhanced services to transition-age youth. So I want to pass this one back to Peter.
Thank you, Phil. So in this strategy, it also discusses the coordination of our youth providers and our youth system, but we ensured, we essentially took components that could be addressed in other strategies like rapid rehousing for youth or coordinated entry system for youth, and put those in the base strategy. So rapid rehousing is in B3, elements of the coordinated entry system are in E7. What's in E14 is really very youth specific, and they don't have easy analogs in other parts of the strategy. Specifically, transitional housing is not a mode of program design that HUD is recommending as best practice nationally for populations other than youth. And I think that we do recognize, though, that it has a value for, it can be developmentally appropriate. We also have a current infrastructure of HUD-funded programs of transition-age youth transitional housing, and that is one of the models that we're recommending here. In addition, we want to make sure that we have a robust lived experience advisory collaborative for youth to advise us on youth homelessness. That is on the youth collaboration. We are looking to increase our collaboration with the LA County Office of Education and provide coordination there. Homeless youth do show up in that. There are family essentially reconnection models, which is essentially, often youth are estranged from their family and become homeless due to that, and work with service providers, can reconnect with family, they can broker arrangements and deals so that families get back together, and that can be an excellent outcome for restabilizing a youth with family. And there are also access centers and drop-in centers for youth that need improvements, and that is one of the things that we're recommending in this strategy as well.
Thank you. All right, so now we're going to move on to the last strategy around the increasing the supply of homeless housing. This is a new strategy that could not be funded with the initial one-time money to preserve and develop additional homeless housing. And this is specifically to capital expenditures associated with homeless housing, not the broader category of affordable housing. So what we, under this request, the request is to use Measure H to fund 1/3 of the capital funding goal established by the Board of Supervisors in October 2015. The Board of Supervisors established a goal of incrementally increasing funding for the county, newly established county affordable housing program for capital expenditures for preservation, rehabilitation, and construction. And in this coming year, that goal is $40 million total, $30 million of which is for capital, hence this request for $10 million, and then that goes to $60 million the following year, $45 million for capital, 1/3 of which is $15 million, and then finally in fiscal year 1920, $80 million total, $60 million for capital, of which 1/3 is $20 million requested here for Measure H. In addition, you'll see here that we have a request of $10 million in one-time funding for a housing innovation fund, because as part of the community's interest and passion in combating homelessness, there are many ideas surfacing around innovative ways to potentially address the shortage of homeless housing that is cheaper and or quicker than traditional models of homeless and affordable housing. So the concept here is to take advantage of the fact, as I mentioned a moment ago, that the demand for funding in year one for some of the strategies will be less in the out years. The suggestion here is to create a $10 million one-time fund that could entertain modest proposals to test new, innovative, and experimental ideas in the area of construction of homeless housing or potentially shelter as well, that then, based on experience, could potentially be integrated on a more robust basis with other funding streams. So this is a kind of incubator or lab for innovative approaches. And we see this is, that's $10 million for that purpose. So that concludes our review of the 19 strategies. Before we open for questions and comments, I'd like to review the next steps in the process. Tomorrow, we will initiate a public comment process around the 19 strategies, where we'll be soliciting public comment on the funding requests which we just reviewed for each of the 19 strategies, as well as general comments. Tomorrow, we will be posting at the Homeless Initiative website, shown on the screen, homeless.lacounty.gov, on the Measure H page within the website. We'll be posting this PowerPoint projected during this webinar, updated funding requests for each of the 19 strategies, which corresponds to the amounts that we reviewed during this webinar. The summary page, which shows all of the requests in one place. and there will be a public input comment form through Google Docs available on the website where any interested member of the public or interested organization can submit comments, and it will be divided by each of the individual strategies with a general comment portion. The deadline to submit those comments is firm at May 1st at 5 p.m. On May 2nd, we will publicly release and distribute to the 50 members of the Measure H Revenue Planning Work Group a compilation of those comments verbatim, sorted by strategy. That will give the planning group 2 days to review those comments before the planning group's next meeting on May 4th. It will be a full day meeting from 9 a.m. to noon and from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. If you are a member of the public intending to attend that meeting, please plan to make arrangements for your own lunch during the lunch break on May 4th. And at that time, the planning group will be discussing the revised funding request that we discussed today with the detailed supporting documents and the community feedback, and trying to work its way towards a set of consensus recommendations to the Board of Supervisors. The final meeting of the Measure H Revenue Planning Work Group will be on May 10th from 1:30 to 4:30 p.m. The May 4th meeting will be on the 30th floor at United Way, 1150 South Olive, which has been the location of the first 3 planning work group meetings. The final meeting on May 10th is at a location that remains to be determined and will be announced at the Homeless Initiative website. Following the meeting on May 10th, the policy deputies for the Board of Supervisors responsible for homelessness will discuss the recommendations along with an associated draft board letter, which our office will prepare, transmitting the recommendations from the planning group. And to the extent that the planning group is not able to reach a consensus on all of the funding recommendations, the divergent perspectives within the planning group will be reflected in the board letter submitted to the Board of Supervisors. Then on June 13th, at its regular Tuesday 9:30 a.m. meeting, the Board of Supervisors will consider and is scheduled to take action on the funding recommendations. I'd like to make one final point before we open for questions and comments. The Measure H Planning Work Group task is to develop a set of funding requests for each strategy to the Board of Supervisors for 3 years, not to make specific recommendations regarding the design of the individual strategies. You heard us mention in the course of this webinar various program design elements which underlie the funding requests. And of course, the requests for funding cannot be divorced from the program design. However, the Board of Supervisors will not be asked on June 13th to approve specific elements of the program design. Instead, the program design descriptions developed by the lead agencies through this process, which build on the original strategies approved by the board last February in 15 of the 19 strategies, excluding the 4 new strategies, will form the foundation for a detailed program design process for each of the strategies. Consistent with the transparent, inclusive, and collaborative approach of the Homeless Initiative from its inception, there is a mechanism through the Homeless Initiative website, which is available on the Measure H page, where any member of the public in any organization can sign up to be part of the detailed implementation planning process for each of the individual strategies. So for those strategies where the funding is increasing from the current level, and or where there are enhancements or modifications to the program design, the lead agency will be responsible for consulting with and convening as appropriate those members of the public who are interested in collaborating in the detailed design. And it is in that setting that those detailed program design discussions and decisions will be made ultimately with the authority line, with the lead agency or agencies in consultation with the County Office of Homelessness. So we're now ready we have 45 minutes to move into comments and questions. We will be taking questions and comments through two mechanisms. I want to encourage as the primary mechanism electronic comments or questions which I will read and then we will seek to respond to. And then if we exhaust the written comments and we still have time available, we will open for questions or comments on the phone. So the first question is from Marie Markel. What are you going to do to help the homeless who are on hospice and have specialized medical needs? So I wonder if I might refer that question to Cherie.
Yes, thank you. We have worked with some of these clients through the interim housing through the health agency, and we have been able to match hospice services to clients who are being served in these settings, typically in a recuperative care setting. So I think that that would be an opportunity that we would continue to be able to offer and to expand as we increase the number of recuperative care beds.
Thank you. The next question is from Calvin. What has been done to prevent homelessness at a greater level, such as encouraging companies to hire, assisting relocation of people prior to homelessness, terrors with jobs, streamlining of the building and permitting process, and ending rent stabilization ordinances to encourage landowners to build housing? So a lot is there, and certainly the last part of that question has a certain point of view surrounding the impact of rent control or rent stabilization ordinances, which I won't comment on, but just want to note that Calvin has a particular perspective that would not be universally shared regarding that relationship. The questions that are raised here, in some instances, go beyond our immediate scope. There are many social challenges associated with, particularly with low wages and high rents. Our focus, and go to poverty more broadly, we are focused on combating homelessness, which includes preventing homelessness, but does not reach to the broader set of issues associated with attacking poverty. Our charge is more laser focused, notwithstanding the impact of those broader issues. However, some of the aspects of Calvin's question do relate to things that we can address directly. One of those involves relocation. If people are homeless or at imminent risk of homelessness, we do have the ability to assist them to relocate, for example, to reunite with family, whether that's for transition age youth, who could reunite with parents or an adult sibling, or an older adult who might be able to reunite with an adult parent. And that family reunification effort is part of our system, and we anticipate that it will increase as a part of our system through the implementation of Measure H. Peter, did you want to weigh in on this question?
Well, so that is a key piece of prevention, obviously, is to ensure that, folks who lose a job or have a reduction in the household income, we do try to relocate those folks to a more affordable unit rather than face eviction. So that is a key, that's one element of prevention. The other is diversion, which is generally ensuring that folks don't, who have been met with a housing crisis, they're at imminent risk of homelessness, about to enter the crisis system, we're able to reconnect, the kinds of strategies that Phil outlined, or to put them into a unit that they can afford rapidly rather than enter the crisis system.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to a brief question from Ricardo Forbes. Will today's PowerPoint be made available to the public? And as I mentioned, it will be. Tomorrow it will be posted on the Measure H website along with the other documents that are in support of the public comment process. I want to move on now to a question from Andrea McPherson. Some people would rather stay homeless or live in unsafe conditions. How do we make sure the shelters are livable? In practicing good faith, how do we make sure these facilities care? Through some personal experience, that's personal experience of Andrea McPherson, not even 50% of case managers practice good faith. And I guess what I would say, and then sort of defer to Peter to add more, is that in our strategies B7 and E8 around increasing and enhancing emergency shelter and bridge housing, we are focused on both increasing the quantity of crisis housing beds and increasing their quality. And the conversion to 24-hour beds from 14-hour beds was an important element of that. And funding for additional housing navigators and other supportive services staff at the shelters, and to bring in other agencies as well, is all part of that effort around enhancing our crisis housing system. Peter, anything to add on that?
Well, I would also say that I think that, I mean, so it's not clear to me what you mean by good faith, but I assume that part of it is that the people conducting these services, whether the case management, whether they're outreach, their housing navigation, are working with people in an authentic way to actually get to a permanent housing outcome for people. I think that one of the key elements of ensuring that we actually do have good connection with folks is that we have an authentic proposal to offer them. I think that one of the, I hear a lot that there are, people experiencing homelessness are service resistant. They don't want help. But I think that is a very easy out for us. And I think it also does not give real credence to the experience of people who have lived in a state of homelessness in Los Angeles, have had the kinds of experiences that you're saying, where they have service providers who are not treating them with respect, are not offering, there's not an authentic outcome that's connected through the services that they're getting. What we're trying to build here is a comprehensive, systemic approach where we have robust case management, they're well coordinated, they're well trained, they're connecting with people in an authentic manner. The service location for their crisis housing is a decent place to go, that the housing outcomes are realistic and authentic at the other end, and that, once we have a real service proposal to offer people, I don't think we're going to see what people have categorized as service resistance.
Okay. So the next question is from Jacqueline Kim, or a comment. If 75% of homeless people are in makeshift dwellings on the street versus shelters, doesn't this say that some money need to go toward public spaces that are homeless friendly? The changes that need to take place within the system of managed care are not going to happen overnight. The homeless people I know are terrified of staying in a shelter. Intermediate solutions need to be implemented. Well, let me just say that the question of resources for permanent housing, our ultimate objective, versus resources for interim solutions, primarily various forms of crisis housing, is one of the key questions confronting this process. And you see in the current state of the funding request that the way in which we've tried to balance that is with a one-time allocation of $93 million for crisis housing for B7 and E8. I'm not sure what Jacqueline has in mind around public spaces, but I will say that the county is aware of safe sleeping and safe parking as options that have been adopted in some communities. There is no funding specifically recommended for those strategies at this time, but this is a multi-year effort, and as we move forward, there may be opportunities to explore that. I would say, however, that staying indoors is better than living outdoors, even in California's generally temperate, in Los Angeles County's generally temperate climate. So rather than reconcile ourselves to having a crisis housing system that many people don't want to use, we need to focus our efforts on enhancing both the quality and quantity of our crisis housing system. Let me move on to the question is, could you please advance the slides? I think that might have been a prior question. I'm sorry if we were behind there. Moving on to a question from Cesar Portillo. what is the total number of new recuperative care beds in E8 and B7 combined each year as currently reflected in the funding request? So let me ask Cherie if you can tackle that.
Yeah, so under those two strategies, it is proposed that we add 500 beds in year one and 400 additional beds in year two for a total of 900 beds. These beds would be for individuals who have more complex health and behavioral health conditions and would have a higher level of on-site services. The exact number of those beds that would be designated recuperative care beds is still being determined and something that we will receive input on during the planning process.
Thank you. Let me go now to Alex Davis. The subcommittee has made new funding recommendations released 4/22 and discussed on this call. Will strategies be updated to reflect these new budgets? Yes. The leads are finalizing revised funding requests to correspond to these new funding amounts, and they will be posted tomorrow on the Measure H portion of the Homeless Initiative website, so that through the public comment process, members of the public will be able to refer to those detailed requests. Moving on to a question from Damian Pipkins. I would like to know if the county will assist someone for up to 12 months, similar to HUD programs such as TBRA and HPRP. Also, will Section 8 project-based vouchers for housing choice vouchers be made available as a long-term permanent housing solution? So let me ask, maybe Peter can tackle that.
So the answer is yes. Actually, the Department of Health Services is currently providing rental assistance through its flexible housing subsidy pool in a very similar manner to TBRA. And the HPRP program, which has been discontinued, the rapid rehousing component is very, very similar to what we're proposing here. So the flexibility we have using these local funds and program design elements as best suit the needs of the community, and we'll be working with the providers and others on program design. But we can extend the length of service under rapid rehousing, and absolutely currently the flexible housing subsidy pool that DHS operates does function very much as a TBRA program. The Section 8 programs under the county and city housing authorities currently do allocate some of their tenant-based vouchers for project basing to develop new permanent supportive housing. As I understand it, that's a major part of the city's strategy under the Measure H capital funding, and that will be as my understanding is there's a significant intent there to project based. But that's a strategy that's been pursued by both our largest public housing agencies and also some of our smaller ones like Pasadena, and it's definitely one that we recommend.
Next, a question from Karen Melendez. Have the 50 members been appointed yet? Because there are so many agencies involved, who will be those 50 people? Is that available on the LAFSA website? So just to clarify, the 50-member planning group is in place. In February, when the Board of Supervisors directed our office to convene this process, the Board of Supervisors designated the categories of participants, and that in most instances, those participants were selected by the organizations themselves. So, for example, each Council of Governments was allocated 1 or 2 slots depending on their size, and then those Council of Governments selected their own representatives. For the homeless service provider representatives, we relied on the members of the recently formed Regional Homelessness Advisory Council, because they had been democratically elected by the providers in each of the service planning areas quite recently, and therefore that election process carried over into the membership of this group of 50. I believe that the roster of the 50 members is currently posted on the Meeting 1. It's posted under Meeting 1 on the Homeless Initiative on the Measure H webpage. But we will move that so that it's prominent enough that it's clear that that roster applies to the entire planning process, not just to the first meeting. Next, I have a question from Chrissy Berkey. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Will there be any capacity building funds available for existing community-based partners who are trying to improve their physical space and physical processes to meet the new requirements of the county?
Absolutely. So that is one of the things that was recognized, it was brought out very strongly by the providers, is the need for capacity building. So physical space is a little tricky to know, but there is capital in some of the strategies for improvement to spaces. For example, in strategy E8, which is focused on enhancing the shelter system, there is capital proposed that would do exactly that, would ensure that, if there's a site that might be made habitable as a shelter, but it needs some work, we can invest in improvements there. But there's definitely capacity building money and technical assistance money for the kinds of back office operations that you're alluding to, where the organization just needs physical depth, they need policies and procedures, they need to meet certain standards of capacity and organizational fitness in order to actually carry these public funds. We're asking for funding to make those investments.
Thank you. So from Yolanda Arias, how will the legal services for strategies A1 and A5, those are the homeless prevention strategies, be procured? Peter?
It will be through an open RFP procurement process.
Thank you. Becky Lee asks, can you elaborate on the role clinics play in strategies C4, C5, and C6? That's the SSI and Veterans Benefits Advocacy strategies. Cherie?
So the countywide benefits advocacy services are intended to serve any client who is homeless or at risk of homelessness, who may be eligible for SSI, SSDI, or Veterans Benefit Services. And so all of those individuals can be referred into the program. The referral mechanism would be through a web-based referral, or for individuals who do not have access to that, we also have just a regular paper referral system, and we will also be rolling out an 800 number that can be used to make a referral. So clinics will be able to refer clients through any of those mechanisms, and we will be making all of this information available very shortly on how to do those 3 different types of referrals. This program just started on April 1st, and so the staff are still getting trained and are setting up their offices, and so they're not quite ready to have those systems go live yet, but they will in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Jen Chico asked, I should know. Sorry, Jen, asked, please provide comment on how the modified funding recommendations were arrived at. So as I mentioned at the conclusion of the 3rd meeting of the revenue planning work group on April 13th, the work group discussed various options about how to move the process forward, including the possibility of forming a subcommittee of the planning group itself. But instead, the planning group opted for asking our office, the County Homeless Initiative, and the lead agencies, county agencies for each of the strategies, to work together to develop a set of revised funding requests that would stay within the estimated $355 million in annual revenue, because the initial funding requests were not subject to that constraint and therefore, in the aggregate, exceeded the amount of available funding. So in response to that request from the planning group, there were 2 meetings of county department representatives to discuss the strategies. The first was between LASA, Department of Health Services, Department of Mental Health Services, and myself, and representatives of our Homeless Initiative team, to look at the 7 core strategies which Peter outlined in the graphic at the beginning of the webinar. And we did that both because they are the core strategies where the funding requests are highest and where there is a particularly high level of interaction between the strategies, for example, between the amount of outreach and the number of people in crisis housing, and between the number of people in crisis housing and the number of people moving into permanent housing. So we did that first, and then we had a follow-up meeting later last week where we brought together the leads for all of the 19 strategies and addressed, sort of confirmed our approach on the 7 core strategies, and then addressed the recommended funding levels for the remaining 12 strategies. But what I can say is that at this point, the county leads, who are members of the planning work group, have, at this point, subject to further discussion, a shared view among themselves regarding the requested allocation of the Measure H funding. Okay, let me move on now to a question from Hannah Shin Haydorn. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Is there any defined role at this stage for cities as funding recipients, or will funding primarily be distributed to specialized local agencies and organizations? So cities are very important partners in this effort and have been since the onset of the homeless initiative. Representatives from 30 different cities participated in the development and the initial strategies, and representatives from 56 cities participated last March 31st in the first ever Regional Mayor's Summit to combat homelessness. And we are committed to continuing to strengthen our relationship with cities and the involvement of cities going forward. That said, with respect to the actual distribution and administration of the funding, as we've shared, the basic structure is with the strategies. So once the Board of Supervisors approves funding amounts for the individual strategies, then that funding will be available to administer to the lead county department or agencies, which includes LASA, for several of the strategies. Then, depending on the design of the strategy, that lead department or agency, in most cases, will contract for the actual delivery of services. So, for example, for C4, C5, and C6, the Department of Health Services has executed competitively procured contracts in each of the service planning areas. With Measure H funding, those dollars will be added to those existing contracts so that those contractors can serve additional clients. Similarly, LASA, through the coordinated entry system, contracts with lead homeless service provider agencies for youth, families, and adults in each of the service planning areas, and some of the Measure H funding would be used to augment those contracts. In other instances, there would be new competitive procurements conducted by the lead agency. So with respect to cities specifically, it is possible that cities would be eligible to respond to competitive procurements for some of the strategies, but it will not be the dominant way in which the Measure H funding is actually utilized. For example, if a city wishes to operate its own emergency shelter, a city may be eligible to respond by itself or in partnership with a homeless service provider that would operate the shelter to a competitive procurement seeking to provide funding to increase the number of bridge housing beds for people exiting institutions and or more general emergency shelter beds. But we have already initiated preparatory work with the lead agencies for each strategies, which are assessing whether competitive procurements will be required or whether existing contracts will be increased. And we will be, as we move forward a bit in the process, we'll be providing that information in a way that's accessible to the public so that any qualifying organizations, be they nonprofit, governmental, or even for-profits, which may be eligible under certain of the strategies, will have ample awareness and opportunity to respond to any of those funding, any of those procurements. We move on now to a question from Mike Bedelson. We have a program in place in which we try to decriminalize homelessness and do outreach. However, it is difficult for local agencies to make a significant impact with their limited resources. Are there going to be any funding opportunities for local law enforcement agencies? So this is a question that remains open in the planning process. At this point, there is, under strategy E6, the countywide outreach system, there is a small request from the Sheriff's Department for funding, which will continue to be discussed in the revenue planning process. And the Sheriff's Department representative in the process has raised the possibility of using Measure H funding for regional law enforcement and homeless outreach teams in each of the service planning areas. So that is a limited item that remains under discussion. There is no other discussion underway regarding funding from Measure H for law enforcement other than the county jail in-reach funding, which is already in place. And under strategy D2, the funding request is to sustain the current level of that program. I would say, however, that though the discussion of funding for law enforcement directly is quite restricted, there is a broad-based interest in collaborating closely with law enforcement agencies so that they can, in fact, align with the LA Sheriff's Department in decriminalizing homelessness, which, though not a Measure H funded strategy because it's not a strategy that requires funding, it's a policy strategy, it is one of the key strategies in the homeless initiative more broadly. I believe it's strategy E4. And therefore, we will be interested in collaborating very closely with law enforcement agencies so that the broader services available to homeless families, adults, and youth can be accessed by law enforcement as an alternative to arrest and incarceration. So whether it's strengthening the coordinated entry system or increasing shelter and bridge housing beds or enhancing the coordinated outreach system, all of these strategies will be very important to law enforcement. And in particular, we envision law enforcement and other first responders being critical users of the new front end of the coordinated outreach system through 211, where we will be reaching out to law enforcement agencies in particular so that they can submit requests for homeless outreach through 211 so that homeless outreach teams can respond to those homeless adults, families, and youth who are encountered by law enforcement. Move on to a question from Jacqueline Kim. It was noted during the course of this meeting, I beg your pardon, I believe that we've already responded to that.
The one above, he didn't know.
Oh, thank you. There's a question from Mark Supper. With DHS becoming a major partner as a funder of some of the strategies, if you do not have a current contract with DHS, what is the process to obtain a contract with DHS? So I'll ask Cherie to respond to that, but specifically also to address which strategies you're talking about in terms of those opportunities.
Yeah. There is an open solicitation on the LA County Department of Health Services website under contracts and grants that's called Request for Statement of Qualifications for Supportive Housing Services. So this is a master agreement list that individuals can apply for and be pre-qualified to receive contracts for a number of the different programs under the Department of Health Services. And so opportunities there exist for possibly B3 rapid rehousing and B7 and E8, those interim and bridge housing opportunities, and also D7 with permanent supportive housing. There's potential as well for some of the street outreach activities mentioned under E6. I think I captured it.
And Cherie, does that, the request for statement of qualifications that's currently open, does that apply to all of those strategies you just mentioned or just some of them?
Yeah, so under that request for statement of qualifications, there's a broad category called intensive case management services. And that service category can be used across outreach, interim housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent housing.
I'd also like to say more broadly on the question of contracting opportunities. The Board of Supervisors adopted a motion in March shortly after the election, directing our office in collaboration with LAHSA and various county departments to look at administrative policies and procedures that might need to be modified in order to expedite the effective utilization of Measure H funding. And in response to that, we issued 2 surveys, one for community agencies who are current or prospective homeless service providers, and one for the county departments involved with the homeless initiative. The former survey for the providers, for the community agencies, was specific to contracting. And we were delighted to receive responses from more than 250 current and prospective providers. And we actually have compiled the results and are now in the process of identifying potential administrative and or policy actions that could be taken to address issues identified by current and prospective providers with the county and or LAHSA contracting process. And it is definitely our intention to both enable current providers to increase their capacity and enable additional qualified agencies to join this countywide movement to combat homelessness by contracting to provide services funded through Measure H. And we will be taking a host of actions oriented towards current and prospective providers that will be intended to ensure that interested agencies have the information they'll need, and more broadly to increase capacity. Peter?
Actually, and LAHSA, we were so impressed by the process that our colleagues at Department of Health Services put together for their request for statements of qualifications that we adopted that approach. So last week, LAHSA's Committee on Programs and Evaluation adopted that platform. We have an open solicitation now at LAHSA as well for to get onto that qualified list of bidders. So trying to separate the actual request for a proposal on a given service from meeting threshold requirements that are related to financial stability and organizational capacity and so forth, so that those don't have to be done at the same time.
And therefore, for an agency that doesn't meet the threshold criteria, does LAHSA intend to do something?
Right. So the one other benefit of that approach, there are many, but one benefit is in our current competitive RFP process, if you do not meet threshold, there's no assistance that LAHSA can provide to you. You're essentially, it's a competitive process. We can't help. But under this approach, it's a rolling admission, and the threshold criteria are very clear. Where we find issues, we can work with the potential provider and address those directly, and that's one way to apply the technical assistance that we're looking at. So the idea is that through this process, we can both identify organizations that would like to do business with us but don't quite yet have the qualifications. We can work with them to get there.
And then when there's an actual contract opportunity, that would be competitive, but the actual contract opportunity under a given strategy would be restricted to those agencies that were already qualified.
That's right.
On the master list.
That's right. So it also just takes the time pressure off of, once if you're trying to respond to a programmatic RFP and meet all the financial qualifications, it puts a lot of pressure on a small organization. So taking those into 2 different time frames can help, just on the capacity side by itself.
Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes. There are a number of people who have submitted multiple questions. So as reading the questions, I'm giving priority to those people who haven't had a question come up yet. And then if time permits, people will go to a second question, though I suspect that that will not be the case. Also, based on the number of written questions at this point, we will not have an opportunity for questions to come in by phone. And I'm sorry if that's excluded anyone from raising their questions. We'll move now to a question from Kelly Jones. Who is the contact to get more information pertaining to survivors of domestic violence and how they are outreaching to DV service providers?
Well, so for LASA, our point person on issues regarding domestic violence and interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence is Jessica Reed. She's in our policy and planning department, and probably email would be best. And she may kick me for this, but it's JREED@lasa.org. That's LAHSA.org. Jay Reed and she's LASA's point person. Obviously, there is a domestic violence task force that exists, and it is chaired by providers. I apologize. I can't recall off the top of my head who the appropriate contact person there would be, but Jessica can probably connect you.
And for the CEO Homeless Initiative, our lead on domestic violence is Leticia Colchado, and her email address is LCOLCADO@ceo.lacounty.gov. And I would just say more broadly on this question that per motion by the Board of Supervisors in February 2016, a great deal of work has been done in trying to bring together the homeless service provider community and the domestic violence provider community, and both LASA and the Homeless Initiative are very committed to continuing this work moving forward. Jane Hansen asks, how will the multiple services needed to prevent homelessness be coordinated?
So that is really one of the things that we've been focusing heavily on, and that is ultimately in strategy E7. The idea is that one lead agency is funded with the capacity to both staff itself, but also provide funding to its partner agencies within the service planning area to bring together all the resources and coordinate them. So there's direct funding at the provider level to do this, but also there is essentially sort of macro level staffing, the staffing for coordination of these functions within the staff at LASA. So that is not directly funded through these strategies, but as part of our administrative element, we're funding, outreach coordination, crisis housing coordination, those elements as well.
Okay, so we have time for probably about 3 more questions. Ann Tompkins asks, in expanding shelter beds, will beds be distributed across more cities rather than just concentrating them in regional hubs? So just in general, I will say that homelessness is a regional problem and that we are interested in citing the full range of housing and related services across the county in a manner that is generally proportionate to the distribution of the homeless population. Citing new emergency shelter and bridge housing is often very challenging, and therefore we will want to focus on pretty much all available opportunities to do so, whether that involves utilizing existing facilities. Obviously that's quicker and less expensive, but it could involve building new facilities as well. So there is no intention to concentrate crisis housing within particular hubs or cities or portions of cities within service planning areas, but rather to address the homeless population and their needs on a regional basis. Peter, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's right. I think I would just reiterate your point that citing such facilities is a challenge. So we would definitely look to the assistance of concerned citizens in the community to help us with citing.
Veronica Gonzalez asks, will programs be required to provide wraparound services once clients are housed? This really goes to the question of retention services. Cherie, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so, we've been talking about 2 types of permanent housing today. One is rapid rehousing and the other is permanent supportive housing. Typically with rapid rehousing, the rental subsidy support and services are time limited. On average, we're usually talking 9 to 12 months, and then that client is usually able to take over their rent and transition off of the services. For permanent supportive housing, those services are viewed as being long-term and continue with the client for as long as they are needed. They're generally not time limited.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 2 more questions from Jason Robinson. On average, what is the estimated cost of housing per person? So this, of course, varies depending on the level of services that are needed, but I think that either Peter or Cherie will address the estimated cost maybe on a monthly basis.
Yeah, so I mean, it's fairly similar for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing for the services, and that could range from $300 to $450 per month per client to provide those wraparound case management services.
And for the housing subsidy?
And the housing subsidy, if the client has a federal subsidy, then there is not a cost associated with that to us locally. If a client is getting assistance with a local subsidy, we're experiencing the average cost of that subsidy in permanent supportive housing to be around $900 a month.
And what about in rapid rehousing?
So it's quite similar. It's just that the duration is less. So you would project a full year for someone in permanent supportive housing, and you would project, say 9 months or 6 to 9 months, something like that for someone in rapid rehousing. Those can taper. The assistance can be on a start at 100% and then taper down over time. So it can be less than that. But
so with services, it sounds like the range, and also for a family, the housing cost could be higher, but generally in the range of $1,200 to $1,500 per month for the rental subsidy and service, which is oftentimes a lot cheaper than the cost of someone remaining on the street. Okay, let's go to the last question. I'm going to ask, go up to the first question from Mariah Moyni, I believe. Is there an evaluation metric or component that actively implements and measures empathic care within this initiative? Might this hold agency staff in the county accountable for changing systems of care that implicitly in the past passed judgment on those that have severe mental illness and are homeless?
That's a really interesting question. I am not sure about metrics on empathic care. We certainly are employing metrics of system performance that relate to the programmatic elements that we're talking about. But your question goes really to a heart of, particularly with regard to the intersection with people who experience mental illness, severe mental illness, which has been a significantly stigmatized group. It's an interesting question. I don't know what those metrics would be, but it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. So thank you for raising that. In a subsequent comment, Mariah noted that empathic care would be measured by the clients themselves, and she says that there are evidence-based tools.
Yes.
So Mariah, if you could send us an email with some further thoughts or links on that, I think that that's a concept that we're interested in exploring, because ultimately, and I'll close the webinar with this, I mean, this is about the human beings who we're trying to help to improve their lives. And this is not just about our heads, but it's about our hearts. And I think we've seen that from the inception of the Homeless Initiative in August of 2015 through the first annual Homeless Initiative Conference that brought 500 people together on February 8th at the Los Angeles Cathedral, to the overwhelming outpouring of passion and compassion that voters across the county exhibited on March 7th when they passed Measure H. So as we go forward and as we do the hard work of data and metrics and numbers and money, we must always keep focus on the fact that these are our homeless neighbors that we're trying to help bring home, and our fellow residents of Los Angeles County. So whatever we can do, whether it's specifically through measuring the level of empathy in the services that are provided, or through incorporating people with lived homeless experience in the planning and, where applicable, the execution of these Measure H strategies, or through other means, we need to continually challenge ourselves and take advantage of opportunities to do that. So I want to thank Peter Lynn from LAHSA and Sheree Tadara from the Department of Health Services for joining me today with this webinar. Most of all, I want to thank the several hundred people who joined us today, and I want to encourage all of you to participate in the public comment process, which begins tomorrow and runs until 5 p.m. on May 1st, and then beyond that, to remain involved as part of this countywide movement to bring our homeless neighbors home. Thank you very much.